Okay, you ready for chapter 5? Graham's Storytime, chapter 5, The Diamond in the Window. This chapter is called The Search Begins, and I'll show you the picture. So pretty much it looks like we're going to look for the kids. The search begins. It was a glorious morning. Eleanor leaned on the kitchen windowsill. She saw Mr. LaRue coming along the street, a trash barrel wallowing in front of him. Mr. LaRue was a carpenter and a handyman. The cool morning breeze, remarkable for the first day of July, was stirring the stately branches of Concord's lofty elms. Along the Walden Street, the elms stood like tall vases in which someone had arranged long leafy boughs. Eleanor felt despotic. "Oh, beautiful elm trees," she said. "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies. Oh, beautiful Mr. LaRue. Oh, beautiful whiskers of Mr. LaRue." The rosy morning light was shining on Mr. LaRue's good-humored old face and lighting up his resplendent handlebar mustache. He walked bow-legged and turned up the path that led to the barn, trundling his empty barrel. Uncle Freddy was already out. He was supposed to be weeding the vegetable patch, but when he saw Mr. LaRue coming, he started to frisk about. Mr. LaRue was used to Uncle Freddy. He stopped politely, lifted his hat, then he turned his barrel upside down and sat on it. Eleanor ran out of doors and leaned her elbows on the silver gazing globe. "Tell me, Mr. LaRue," said Uncle Freddy, "what is written on the wind?" He cocked his head up and put his hand behind his ear, as though he were listening to the breeze. Mr. LaRue listened too, then hunched his shoulders. He didn't know. "Henry knows," said Uncle Freddy, "and so does Waldo." And he jumped up on a tree stump, pointing his finger fiercely at Mr. LaRue. "Oh, mortal," he said, "thy ears are stones." Mr. LaRue looked worried and pulled at his big ears. They felt the same as ever, and he looked relieved, but Uncle Freddy still glared at him accusingly. "Oh, Mr. LaRue, call not nature dumb," recited Uncle Freddy. "These trees and stones are audible to me. The wind that rustles down the well-known forest road, it hath a sound more eloquent than speech." Uncle Freddy jumped suddenly off the stump and made a lunge at the vegetable garden. He pulled lustily at a carrot top, and when it came up too suddenly, he rolled over backwards. Mr. LaRue set him gently back on his feet. Uncle Freddy was waving the muddy carrot in front of his eyes. It was a funny one, with two orange legs like a man. "Brother!" cried Uncle Freddy. "Kinsman!" He was talking to the carrot. Eleanor giggled. Then he introduced the carrot to Mr. LaRue, who tipped his hat again and shuffled politely. "Immense unity!" groaned Uncle Freddy, and then he put his arm around Mr. LaRue and dangled the carrot in front of him, discussing it as if he were telling Mr. LaRue about their new mutual friend. "We're all made of one hidden stuff, Mr. LaRue. What is a tree but a rooted man? The elm tree thinks the same of me. So does my friend and brother here." Uncle Freddy took a huge muddy bite out of the carrot, and then stuck what was left of it in his frayed lapel and smiled triumphantly. Mr. LaRue picked up his ash can and rolled it noisily away. He enjoyed listening to Uncle Freddy. It gave him a kind of mysterious good feeling, like church, only out of doors in the sunlight. Eleanor ran to look for Eddie. Today they were determined to find at least one or two of the hidden jewels, even if it was just one or two pearls or a small ruby. She found him at work in the tower room. He was copying the mystic verses into his notebook, squinting at them and writing carefully with his tongue between his teeth. He finished, and together they pored over what he had written, and they spent the rest of the day searching for clues. First they cudgeled their brains over the harp that played angelic chords. Eleanor could see it clearly in her mind. It would be a great gold-carved one with 1,000 strings. "But they're very valuable, I know that," she said. But they couldn't think where to look. For a while they wandered vaguely around the attic, but there weren't any boxes or trunks nearly big enough to contain such a gigantic musical instrument, so they gave up on that for a moment and looked further down the list of treasures. Eleanor's attention fastened on the doll fit for a princess. How lovely it would be! Surely it must have golden hair and beautiful silken dresses. Perhaps it would look like a princess itself. She went off on an expedition of her own, groping through Aunt Lily's trunks, making a mess of the linens and the winter clothes. But she came away empty-handed, smelling faintly of mothballs. Edward, too, had been unsuccessful. He had been unable to find a mirror that hid a treasure. Starting with the mirror at the tower room, he had pushed up and down the sideways on the moldings in search of secret hiding places. He had shoved the big mirror-topped dressers away from the walls to look behind them, and he had stood on his head in front of them to look at himself upside down. Short of prying the wooden backs off of them to see if $1,000 bills were hidden under the silver glass, he didn't know anything else to do. Some of the verses were just so puzzling they didn't know where to begin. How could they learn to fly in order to bring down the diamonds in the sky? The treasure rounded by the sea lay somewhere deep and dark. Where was that? And who and where was the bride of snow? Then Eleanor had a bright idea about the last verse. Eye of bird, eye of fowl, hides the treasure chest. What about Percival? He was a bird. He was a fowl. She went straight to the peacock at the stair landing and looked carefully at his eyes. They were small, hard, black beads. Maybe one was a button, and if you pressed it, the peacock would open his mouth and jewels would pop out. She tried it. Nothing happened. She tried pressing, twisting, and squeezing both eyes at once, and then she got a knitting needle and gouged the eyes out altogether, apologizing under her breath to Percival all the time. They came out easily enough. Underneath each was just a hollow socket, in which it had fitted, a socket lined with dried glue. Eleanor pushed her finger hard on the insides of the sockets. Nothing happened. Then she tipped Percival over and sat down on the steps with his head in her lap. Carefully and ruthlessly she cut the stitches along the top of his head with her sewing scissors and pulled his poor moth-eaten skin back. The inside of his head was just a wooden knob covered with cotton padding. Eleanor took the padded knob out, shook it, squeezed it, then hurriedly stuffed it back and sewed it up. Percival's head again as carefully as she could. Then she glued the eyes back with its paste and stood back to look at him. Was he all right again? There's something a little staring and cross-eyed about him now. I'm sorry, Percival, mumbled Eleanor, and went off feeling guilty and hoping Aunt Lily wouldn't notice. Meanwhile, Edward had the third treasure all figured out. There must be a chest of jewels, like a pirate chest, at the bottom of Walden Pond. They would have to hire a rowboat to explore the bottom with a huge net or a long hook. He had heard a rumor about that in the middle of Walden Pond was bottomless. In that case, perhaps they could hire a diver. Of course, Trevor Nosnibor was the sort of fellow who would go down into the fathomless depths himself. But even Trevor would have to have a diving suit. Perhaps they should find some of the other jewels first and use the money from them to invest in the boat and the diving gear. But where were the other jewels? By supper time, Edward and Eleanor were thoroughly discouraged. The game didn't seem so much fun, after all. The clues were too hard. Perhaps Ned and Nora had been given a second set of clues to help them, or perhaps they had just been smarter. After supper, their gloom increased. Aunt Lily had taken on a whole new set of evening piano pupils, and from now on Edward and Eleanor were going to have to wash the supper dishes all by themselves. They were slow about it the first time. When the last pot was put to soak, Eleanor went to the parlor curtain and peeked through. Timothy Shaw was taking a lesson. Timothy was a member of Aunt Lily's church choir. He had a very good tenor voice, but he wasn't really interested in playing the piano. He had started taking lessons because he was sweet on Aunt Lily. He was fumbling and bumbling badly. Aunt Lily was severe. Timothy was abject. At last he went home, after lingering for a long time in the doorway, then almost falling down the front steps, saying goodbye. Aunt Lily came into the kitchen and leaned warily against the sink. "Oh, dear," she said. Terrible words rose up from the cellar. Eddie was down there having a last look, looking around for clues. Aunt Lily called down the stairs. What did you say? Eddie answered in an angry roar. I said a swear. That's what I thought, said Aunt Lily. Whatever is the matter? I dropped the toolbox on my toe, bellowed Edward. Aunt Lily dealt with the wounded toe. Eddie was sore. Eleanor was glum. Aunt Lily was pale and tired. I don't suppose, said Eleanor suddenly, you'd let us sleep in the tower room. Aunt Lily put her hand to her head and tried to think about it. Well, why not, after all? The thing that happened there was very long ago. Well, go ahead, she said. Delighted, Edward and Eleanor decided to go to bed right away. They put on their night clothes hurriedly and climbed the attic stairs and the ladder steps. They jumped into the small beds. Excitedly, they leaned on their elbows and looked out the window. It was thrilling to be up so high in their own secret place. The street lights were far below, shone around the edges of the huge leafy elm trees. The breeze that had freshened the morning was still playing with the smaller branches, lifting them gently and letting them go again. Away across the mill pond there were window lights. You could see Emerson's house from here, said Edward. His ghost is walking, said Eleanor. It's just the caretaker, said Edward. Eleanor drifted off to sleep, found herself thinking of something Uncle Freddie had said when he was talking to Mr. LaRue. The elm tree thinks the same as me. What did that mean? She had a funny picture of old Ralph Waldo Emerson standing in his front yard, talking on a crank-up telephone that was attached to the trunk of an elm, and the elm tree talking back to him and nodding its head and agreeing. And into the room the diamond shed its own faceted light, gathered from the street lights and the starlight and the window of Emerson's old house. Softly the light shone over the two children's beds, and over the possessions of Ned and Nora, and over the slumbering faces of Edward and Eleanor. The end. The end of that chapter. That's pretty brave to go back and sleep in that same room. So you see, this book was written from a long time ago, and Eleanor has a candle in her hand, so they have some light. Interesting. I wonder what happens next.